are doing a very complicated job in an exemplary fashion, as has been mentioned. But I will just say to you, in terms of that part of the city, the Fort York Armories is located a couple of blocks away from the Better Living Centre, so that is why I've mentioned today that we're going to be pursuing the matter of the Moss Park Armories, where if we need this 7th Respite Centre, that is probably an appropriate place, subject to the right answers being received from the National Defence and Community Safety departments in Ottawa to have that 7th Respite site.
Was the city caught off guard? I mean, advocates have been warning for a very long time that we're facing a crisis. Do we have enough staff? Is that part of the problem of that miscommunication with the shelter person saying there's no room? And was the city woefully unprepared for this situation? I
think the answer to the question is no, we were not. We had a plan in place for the winter, but when you look at what actually transpired in terms of weather that is being described as unprecedented, I think the day a couple of days ago was the coldest day in 50 years. The refugee situation, which was something that obviously was coming to our attention as the year wore on, we took steps. But again, I think this is a very fluid, evolving situation, and I think the challenge that's in front of us is to adapt to that situation as circumstances change, whether it be the weather, whether it be the influx of people, some of whom are coming from other parts of the region, not just from Toronto. And so that's what we're doing. With respect to the communications, I want to just say this, and I say this without taking away for 1 minute from the praise that was heaped upon by all of us, the staff, the city staff. The communication that miscommunication that took place, where people were told there was not space when in fact there was, is not defensible. And that is something we have to get to the bottom of, as to how that could happen, that somebody could phone one part of the city government and be told there was no space when in fact there was space, and if they'd made a phone call to another part of the city government, that would have been confirmed. And that is why I welcome Mr. Raftis' leadership in coming to the, getting to the bottom of this, as well as the Ombudsman's inquiry. I think these will be most welcome in terms of identifying something that I suspect, when we boil it down, is going to come down to, as in so many other areas of city government, a complete lack of technology, a complete lack of modernization of how any kinds of records are kept on these kinds of things, to the point where people are again using clipboards and pens to keep track of things, and you're going to get, I think, miscommunication of information. But the fact is that no one should have been told at any time, because it just wasn't true, that there wasn't space available for them. And that was confirmed to me by the staff at Peter Street last night, who told me, had they got the calls from anybody, that there would have always been a space found. They always find a space, and there has been a space throughout the period that we're talking about for anybody who looked for one.
So what has been done for tonight to ensure that that doesn't happen?
The city got caught off guard. When housing prices have been going up steadily for a while, the immigrant situation's coming in over the last couple of years, and you know, every winter it's cold, every winter someone dies on the street. How can you possibly be caught off guard?
I think Austin, Ana Bailão addressed that very well in her remarks, because we're not dealing here with something that is where you respond to it at the drop of a hat. We can come here forward with things that expand our emergency shelter offering to people, which is what we're doing today. But in the end, the answers that really are needed, and it goes, you know, if the refugees started coming a year and a half or 2 years ago, the fact is that that is a long-term integration process that has to continue and be stepped up. With respect to things like mental health, putting that supportive housing in place is not something that can happen overnight, and there have been some small steps forward, positive steps taken by the provincial government, but there is much more that needs to be done. And in terms of the ultimate issue of affordable housing, that too is something that even when we put up our pieces of land, for example, and for the first time in a decade actually meet and exceed the targets for approval set by the City Council 5 or 6 years ago. For the first time now we have a national housing strategy from the Government of Canada. But the implementation of that, those new measures and that new resolve to address all of these issues, supportive housing for mental health, refugee integration, national housing strategy, is going to take time. And I'm sorry it's going to, but the reality is we are now, I believe, addressing these issues, and we need to do more on mental health, but before they just weren't being addressed. The city's housing targets weren't being met, supportive housing was not being funded, and so the result you have is this huge number of people who are seeking permanent residence, frankly. In many cases they're living for 1,000 days in an emergency shelter, which is meant to house people for a few days or a few weeks while they get permanent housing.
Prove they actually know that there are real beds in the world that are actually empty.
I think, Mr. Cole, the fact that I gave those numbers in part. I beg pardon?
The numbers that you provide.
Well, no, what I said here, for example, the Better Living Centre had 99 spaces filled last night out of 140.
Yes, but that's not the total system.
No, but I'm just saying that's one, and then I went through and said Cowan had space for 16, and I mentioned a number of others that were at capacity. So the answer to your question is yes.
Okay.
There's a report provided each day that talks about what the capacity was in each shelter, and we get that every day, as we did. I'm sure there's no reason why not. This is public information. Sure.
But are we not
Mayor-
well over capacity if you take into account the people that are sleeping on mats on the floors, the people that are in the Peters Street building that are sleeping on chairs in the lobby? Aren't we then well over capacity?
I will just say that in some cases, people end up in a place, whether it's at Peter Street, and I talked to some of them at Peter Street last night and said, well, you could go to the Better Living Centre and sleep in a better circumstance, not one that I would describe as ideal, but better. And they said, no, they wanted to stay there. I mean, again, part of the challenge that we face as a city, and I have been out, not this year, but last year I was out with the street outreach workers to actually listen to and engage in the conversation with some of the people that they reported having met last night on the street. And they say, thank you very much. They're very polite. They have a story to tell, which if you engage them, they will, but they don't want to go to some of these different kinds of places. I think the answer to your question is yes, there's an overall underhousing of a lot of people who are in far less than desirable circumstances. In fact, I would argue every single one of these people, of the 5,000, are in circumstances that are not what we would want for them. And that is why some of the things that Councillor Bailão mentioned, Deputy Mayor Bailão, are important, addressing mental health with supportive housing, addressing affordable housing generally. But what we're doing for the moment is making sure that people in the face of the cold weather and other circumstances existent in the city have a place to go, and that the information, even as importantly, is properly communicated to them so they know where to go and where to find the space, because the fact is there has not been a day yet, and we will keep moving to make sure there isn't a day where there isn't a space for someone who needs it.
Saturday, Sunday,
One at
Mayor
a time.
Tory.
Sorry, David. Yeah,
Mayor
go
Tory,
ahead.
stepping away from the cold weather for a minute, December 21st, we had a story about a woman who broke her leg, a homeless woman, and was able to find space on a yoga mat, but people tried for 4 days to find her a shelter spot and couldn't. Earlier, I believe in the summer, we had a Pierre Gregoire who was at a drop-in center, was fed, but was told there's no room for you tonight, and he ended up overdosing in a KFC bathroom. Activists who are on the front lines are saying, beyond the immediate crisis of cold and whether there was miscommunication, there's an overall crisis in the system where people who need help are not getting it. And they're questioning your commitment to it, especially since in the last budget, you led council to cut some frontline shelter staff. So do you have a commitment to what exactly you're going to do?
Well, I would just say that the commitment that we will be giving to housing and shelter generally this year, and I think Councillor Bailão again went over this, will be at an unprecedented level. And we will continue to provide the support, as we've indicated, no hesitation in doing whatsoever. At the council meeting in December, there was no discussion of the budget that was involved in the expansion that the council approved at that time. You heard it said this morning that at no time did the question of budget or money ever come up during the discussions this past week about what we needed to do to make sure people were looked after. Now, where I will strenuously agree with you in the comments that you just made, and I think both of the examples you gave are examples where a temporary shelter system meant to provide people with emergency shelter in the event that they're homeless is not meeting the need of people with mental health issues or with complicated health issues of one kind or another. I met people last night, a man who'd had a stroke, and he's disabled, and he's in a scooter, and he is in one of our temporary shelters and shouldn't be there. He has complex needs, some of which are mental health related because he's had some issues with depression following his stroke. And we have nothing better to offer him in the absence of supportive housing. I talked to two people with addiction issues last night. The good news for both of them is they're going to programs in different fairly far-flung places of Ontario. But I think in a way it's interesting that they have to go that far away to get the treatment programs they need to help them get off drugs. And so one of the reasons I indicated today that I want to take up in earnest and with great determination the issue of, for example, mental health is because a huge portion, I would argue it might even be a majority of the people who are in our temporary shelters that we keep expanding and expanding are in fact people who need supportive housing, should not be in shelters, and they're not getting the support they need in the shelters, although we need to provide that obviously for them as a place to put their head down at night where it's warm and safe. But they're not getting the support they need.
Mayor Tory, I appreciate
Sorry,
that.
we're just going to go. Sorry, Travis, you had one, and we're going to go here, and then we'll come over to you. Okay?
Appreciate that you've outlined kind of.
No, I said we're going to go to this one.
We're going to go
first,
this one.
and then
All
sorry.
right.
You spoke with people that you met last night and that they are very polite and have stories and they'd rather not go to the Better Living Center. The people I'm speaking to say they don't want to go to whether or not there are tokens to get them there, they're more comfortable in their surroundings, which is generally the east side, which is near Moss Park. And so my question is, why is it so complex to get these armories open, specifically Moss Park, if 4 times in the past they've been open in conditions that have not been as bad as what we're experiencing right now?
I think that anytime you're dealing with a different government, you're dealing with a military installation where they have to carry on with their functions there. You were dealing with some questions that have existed in the past when they've been used about their availability on a 24-hour basis, because it's one of the appeals to the Better Living Centre is we don't have to ask people to leave at 7 o'clock in the morning. So I think that, as I've said, we have been posing those questions to the Government of Canada. They have to take into account answering those questions in a way that also takes account of the use of those buildings on an ongoing basis. I think that, as you've seen, they've generally indicated there's a degree of receptiveness to receiving these questions, and I've asked for some answers by the end of the day tomorrow, which I think is within their capacity. They've indicated that. And so when it comes to Moss Park, I've said if we get the right answers to those questions, we will move ahead to designate that in all likelihood as the 7th respite. It will certainly have my support, and we'll do that. But we opened the Better Living Centre, and I will say that I did talk to the people last night, and they only told me what they told me, and not one of them raised the issue of having trouble getting there. They all said they were very grateful that it existed, that they had found their way there. They found their way there such that we've expanded it, and we will now try and do the same to create a 7th respite centre in all likelihood in the eastern part of the city, probably or quite possibly at the Moss Park Armories.
Mayor Tory, I appreciate that you have talked about what the plans are in the months and the days to come. But for tonight, what is going to happen? Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, people were told that there is no room. People were turned away. What happens tonight to ensure that that communications issue does not happen again?
I think that message has been received. I was going to say, with the greatest respect, where people were told that, that was false information that they got, because there were spaces that people could have been referred to all of those nights without exception, including last night. And going forward, I've indicated that we're going to expand the Better Living Centre, and we had some other excess capacity last night to take account of people who might have needed space. So I would just say we're proceeding with the expansion of the Better Living Centre, a further expansion again today. We're watching this on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour basis, and we'll do what we have to do. But as for the information, I think the message has been received loud and clear that it is just not acceptable for people to be given false information. I think you're going to find a significant improvement in that, in the sense that if at least we rely on the one source of information we have, which is checked every day at 4 o'clock, as Mr. Raft has told you in quite a bit of detail yesterday, 4 o'clock in the morning, we will then be able to go forward and give people accurate information about where they can get help and make sure they get to the place where they're going to get that help.
Do you think it was a...
Sorry, yeah, go ahead, John.
Approach of scaling it up bit by bit to 110 beds to 140, why not go bigger than that? Why not ask the federal government for help sooner?
Well, we've asked, and in fact, as I indicated to you, that in the event that they come forward with satisfactory answers, it's a likelihood that a 7th respite centre with 100 beds would be created at the Moss Park Armory. But with respect to the Better Living Centre, part of the reason that we started at, I think, 20 and have scaled ourselves up to now 140, tonight 150, is in order to make sure we do it in a way that we can provide proper, sensitive service to the people and staff it appropriately. And having been there last night, they're coping fine with that, and there were 40, I think I said 41 spaces that were available there last night that were not used, and they will be available tonight, plus 10 more. So I would just say to you that we are monitoring this on a day-by-day basis, but the very fact we're having the discussion about the Moss Park Armories and about the discussions with the federal government is because our staff have identified yesterday that the likelihood of a 7th respite centre being needed is something that they concluded yesterday and told me yesterday, and we're acting on it today. We acted on it yesterday,
and what
actually.
about spaces for families? Shelter capacity for them is 100%. Shelter capacity for youth is 97%. What about them?
It's one of our most difficult challenges. I might ask Mr. Raftis if he'd come forward, but it is a difficult challenge. I can tell you right now that the challenge gets more difficult as you get to couples, let alone couples with children, and then couples with children becomes even more complicated in terms of just the capacity of the system and the challenge involved in expanding that. It's easier to expand a service where you are having single people who can stay with one another, either women or men. But maybe you'd like to talk to the family situation, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The family situation, so if we look back earlier in the year, we've actually added about 1,400 beds to the system. Many of those beds have been in the family sector to meet that demand, and we continue to have that demand come on a regular basis. So we have our team working closely with people who are calling. Where people are already in existing housing, then we talk to them about moving into shelter when an appropriate bed becomes available, as long as they are in housing at that time. If they do not have access to housing, then we move them in right away. So we have expanded that capacity in the last year on a very large scale.
But right now, do they have a place to go tonight?
Yes, absolutely. So again, when people call in and we talk to them about their individual circumstances, if they're staying with